I bet you've met Nathaniel. He's the one always pressing religious people to explain what's the big deal about Jesus. You must have met Nathaniel. He's that neighbor that notices you dressed up on Sunday morning, quizzically eyeing you as you rush on to church. "What are you up to this morning?" he asks, and you tell him reluctantly, "I'm on my way to church." Most people in this town leave it at that, but not Nathaniel. He's the one guy you know can't help but take it a step farther. Why go to church? You hem and haw about community and spirituality and the way it centers you in hard times. Something vague and sufficient for most other people, happy to spare both of you the discomfort of having to say something more, but you know it won't be enough for Nathaniel. "I know church has something to do with Jesus," he presses you. "What's your take on him?" I bet you've met Nathaniel. Some have called him the patron saint of skeptics. Philip knows that well, fresh with good feelings for meeting Jesus for the very first time. Philip runs to tell Nathanael that they found the one foretold by Moses and the prophets. But Nathanael's not having any of it. Jesus of Nazareth? There's nothing about Nazareth in Moses' biblical books. The prophets never said anything about Jesus or Nazareth. What could be such a big deal about him? Religious feeling isn't enough for Nathanael. Neither is duty or the authority of tradition. So the church has sometimes had a hard time making room for people like him. Maybe that's why many of us have never heard of Nathanael. He's not mentioned in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. He doesn't show up in any of the songs that some of us Baptists had to memorize in Sunday school. Jesus called them one by one, Peter, Andrew, James, and John. Next came Philip, Thomas, too, Matthew, and Bartholomew. James, the one they called the less, Simon, also Thaddeus. There's no Nathanael in there. His name means sent by God, but you'd never know it the way that he challenges. The church has tended to keep Nathanael at bay, which is probably where Nathanael is more comfortable hanging out anyway. The church asks questions like the ones you'll hear in the ordination service for officers next week. Do you sincerely believe the scriptures of the Old and New Testaments to be the Word of God written in God's Word to you? But Nathanael just keeps asking, why? How do you know? For what purpose? This obviously makes Nathanael kind of hard to live with. Sometimes you just want to put your feet up on the proverbial couch of an easy faith. Let good feelings about Jesus be enough. Listen to the music that he inspired others to write. Let him represent compassion and love and grace without having to define what any of that means. Sometimes you just want Nathanael to receive your good feelings about Jesus as enough. Leave it alone, Nathanael. Enough already. But other times, Nathanael can be your best friend. He's the one you wish was at your house when the religious people ring the doorbell to share with you all those pamphlets about Jesus. You just smile and say thank you, but you know that if Nathanael was there, he'd say, "What do you mean when you say my salvation? Define that term. Why would you spend your Saturday trying to get me to pray the Jesus prayer when there are kids hungry in the world, the earth is warming up, and all sorts of things that seem at least as urgent? Why do you think this is the most important thing?" Nathanael's the one who wonders how Jesus can make such a difference when the people who profess faith in him sometimes do or say things that make them seem not much better or even worse than others. He's not afraid to say that to celebrity preachers and politicians claiming God and country and churches who toot their own horns a little too much. You respect Nathanael. He calls it like he sees it. There's no deceit in him. Yet what intrigues you about Nathanael is that despite all of his skepticism, his careful, deliberate, thinking way, Jesus still gets to him. And you have no idea how. I saw you under the fig tree before you spoke to Philip, Jesus says, and Nathanael suddenly starts to sound like some of the religious people he's critiqued. Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. But then you notice the fig tree that Jesus mentions when he tells Nathanael how he got to know him. You remember how Adam and Eve used its leaves to hide their unnecessary shame. How Micah, when talking about the coming day of the Lord, when all wars would cease and people would all sit under their own fig trees and no one would be afraid. And you remembered what lay underneath your own skepticism, that desire to be known by another. Truly be known with all your fear and goodness and shame and possibility to be seen and still be loved. To come out from behind the protection that we add year after year with our education or our money or our privilege or our stuff, like layers of armor that we add to keep the slings and arrows out, realizing too late that those layers also lock us in. Maybe it's the experience of being loved for who he is that brings Nathanael to his sputtering confession, Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. The experience of being loved by that same perfect love that imagines the world whole, just, at peace, imagines the world complete in its own possibilities. Maybe it's being known like that for the very first time that shocks Nathanael into the realization that sometimes we search and find God, yes, but sometimes it is God who searches and finds us. Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel. Through the centuries, the church has often made the mistake of lifting up this kind of pithy confession for us to regurgitate. Instead of lifting up the tear-stained, angst-ridden, hard-fought path that often leads there. Lifting up the Dr. Kings of the world at the pinnacles of their life's witness without ever acknowledging the little Martin who at age 13 rejected the bodily resurrection of Christ, or who in college said he regretted ever going to church, without ever understanding that Nathanael's journey toward faith nearly disappeared from the holy book is sometimes the only way to reach the kind of faith that moves mountains, that transforms nations, that parts waters of the world in times where waters seem all that there is. Richard Rohr wrote that doubt and faith are correlating terms. People of great faith often suffer bouts of great doubt at many levels, he said, because they continue to grow at new levels. To stay too long in infantile religion leaves you vulnerable to being easily scandalized, prone to oppositional thinking, defensive, and generally unable to be inclusive, conversational, and respectful with those outside your small circle, Rohr says. And yet even so, the Nathanaels of the world know that leaving infantile religion is a painful, disorienting process. I wish we knew more about Nathanael in the Bible. He disappears from the text almost as soon as he is introduced. Perhaps shortly after his straightforward confession of faith, he went right back to his skeptical ways. I wouldn't be surprised at all. Some of the most faithful people I know move between confession and question, faith and doubt. If Richard Rohr is right, then perhaps it means they are growing. Maybe the writer of John's gospel didn't find that kind of swing back and forth helpful to proclaim his straightforward message that Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life. But I think most of us are quite familiar with Nathanael where we live. Not just the Nathanaels we meet next door, but the Nathanael inside each of us. That agitating questioner of God. That voice that won't allow us to regurgitate statements about Jesus until we've come to believe them ourselves. That questioner in each of us that keeps pushing us to struggle like Jacob with the mysterious stranger in the night. Like the woman at the well, continuing to ask Jesus question after question until the relationship there becomes more real than any other. That anxious voice of doubt that won't allow us to take the easy path. In the heat of the Montgomery bus boycott that our children raised for us this morning, that voice of doubt crept up into Martin Luther King Jr. One night when Coretta was already asleep, the phone rang. It was another death threat. And Dr. King went to the kitchen, made himself a cup of coffee, and as he described it, tried to think of a way to move out of the picture without appearing to be a coward. He thought about his young family. Something said to me, he said, you can't call on daddy now, you can't even call on mama. You've got to call on that something in that person that your daddy used to tell you about. That power that can make a way out of no way. With my head in my hands, I bowed over the kitchen table and I prayed aloud. The words I spoke to God that midnight are still vivid in my memory. Lord, I'm down here trying to do what's right. I think I'm right. I am here taking a stand for what I believe is right. But Lord, I must confess that I'm weak now. I'm faltering. I'm losing my courage. Now I'm afraid. And I can't let the people see me like this, because if they see me weak and losing my courage, they will begin to get weak. The people are looking to me for leadership, and if I stand before them without strength and courage, they too will falter. I am at the end of my powers. I have nothing left. I've come to the point where I can't face it alone. It seemed as though I could hear, Dr. King said, the quiet assurance of an inner voice saying, Martin Luther, stand up for righteousness, stand up for justice, stand up for truth, and lo, I will be with you even until the end of the world. Friends, I wish I could just have you memorize those words. Justice, righteousness, truth, and assure you that they'd be there for you when you're called to do hard things in a world misshaped by injustice. I wish the assurance of the power of the assurance, lo, I will be with you even until the end of the world, could be given to any of us just as easily when our time comes to put our reputation or our life on the line to do what is right. But something tells me that for those words to contain the kind of power that they held for Dr. King that night, you've got to question them, turn them upside down, sift them through with your questions until you find yourself, sometimes in ways you cannot explain or even understand, professing a faith that is about way more than words or doctrines or statements. Faith in a God who still baffles you with love and grace and courage that finds you despite yourself. I bet you've met Nathaniel. He's the one always pressing religious people to explain what's the big deal about Jesus. I know you must have met him, the patron saint of skeptics, whose name means sent by God. Despite the church's difficulty in making room for people like him, Jesus calls him an ordinary person into ministry, and he's probably still trying to figure out just how it happened.